Good afternoon, everyone. As we draw the curtains on the Graduate Research Meet 2024, I would like to thank all of you for your valuable contributions. Your participation and enthusiasm has made this event a great success with over 15 sessions that have not only enriched us but also sparked some important conversations. To mark the conclusion of our conference, I am delighted to invite our esteemed guest, Ms. Aanchal Malhotra. Aanchal Malhotra is a distinguished writer and oral historian from New Delhi, who is renowned for her explorations of the 1947 partition's legacy. Co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory, Ms. Malhotra's works intricately weave personal stories and material culture to reveal the enduring impact of partition. Her acclaimed books, Remnants of a Separation and In the Language of Remembering, offer a poignant examination of this historical event through the objects and memory of those affected. Her debut novel, The Book of Everlasting Things, further showcases her narrative prowess. Educated at Ontario College of Art and Design and Concordia University, Ms. Malhotra's academic journey laid the foundation for her compelling storytelling. Her books have garnered significant recognition, including the Council for Museum Anthropology Book Prize, while also being shortlisted for several prestigious awards, including the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar and the British Academy Book Prize. Beyond her literary achievements, she actively contributes to oral history projects and peace initiatives like Project Dastan. Ms. Malhotra's work stands as a testament of her dedication towards preserving and understanding the human dimensions of historical event. Her work resonates deeply with our theme of power, movement, and memory. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Aanchal Malhotra to the dais as she brings this wonderful gathering to a close. I also request Dr. Kiran Keshwamurthy to please chair the session. Thank you.
We welcome you and we look forward to listening to you say. Please, sir.
Good.
Do we have John here? John.
when I received the topic of this year's conference, which was Power, Movement in Memory, I thought about how broad and encompassing the theme was. And that's something that the last 2 days of different papers have shown us in a variety of disciplines. Our keynote looked at collective memory from the outside, a very broad spectrum of memory. And I want to end with us looking at personal memory, the quality of looking inward at how historic memories are made, how they are unmade, how they are kept, and how, when and why they are finally shared. I will speak about my decade-long work with survivors of the 1947 partition from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the diaspora. The history of all 4 of my grandparents can be traced back to what is now Pakistan. In the year 2013, I began speaking to eyewitnesses to know what had happened during partition. Like many others, I had inherited a history that had defined the generation of my ancestors and displaced them from their homes and lands. These are my grandparents, all 4 of them, who came from different parts of what became Pakistan, from as close as Lahore and as far as the Afghanistan border. When I began this work, very immediately I felt that partition was a word which had receded in public memory, but continued to linger in private discourse. I hadn't grown up with stories of it, which is strange if you have all 4 grandparents who have migrated from what is now Pakistan. And actually, questions about partition weren't always welcome either, and they were often met with more questions. There's a very unique it's a unique phenomena where when you ask a question about an event like partition or the Holocaust or any kind of genocide, whether it be Armenian, Rwandan, you will be asked a question back. Why do you want to know? My grandparents would ask me this all the time. What will it change? Obviously the answer is nothing. It would change anything and nothing. But the anecdotes that did reveal themselves were only ones of nostalgia or sentimentality or lament, which meant that anything that touched on the brutality of partition or the lack of belonging proved inaccessible. And the added complication was the fact that I didn't know how to ask questions. I was 23 years old in 2013 and I had no background of oral history. I was at the time studying to be a metal engraver. So you can imagine that I didn't know anything, least of all how to begin asking these questions gently. What words can I use? What topics were off limits? And where was the boundary one had to maintain when asking these kinds of questions? And whenever my questions were met with silence, when they often were, the process began to feel very invasive. And it forced me to look for other forms of remembrance, like objects. I used the aid of migratory objects, that is, objects that refugees had carried across the border at the time of partition, both to India and to Pakistan, by that I mean East and West Pakistan, to talk about the pre-partition past. And there were things like this. They were very ordinary things, very mundane household objects, or you can see weapons, jewelry, utensils, things like this. These kinds of objects became portals for survivors to return to the landscape of their homeland and start to make distinctions between Vatan and Desh, which is homeland and nation state, the one they left behind and the one they adopted. And it also encouraged conversations extending beyond nostalgia or lament. But in those early months that I was doing this work, what I didn't realize is that we were actually constructing a new language to talk about a historic loss. A language that did not allow the experience of partition to remain in the past, but also exert some kind of influence over mine and subsequent generations' presence. You see, the object softened people into their past. It reintroduced them, situated them, resituated them, sometimes yes into a world of violence and othering, but more than often into the everyday life of when the object was used, how it was used, how they lived in an unpartitioned land. As these things were brought out, as they were talked about, caressed, smelled, examined, memories spilled out with them. So, how did people treat their own memories? How do people gain ownership over their own stories? Particularly when these stories and memories have been suppressed for decades. Many times people would say to me, oh, well, I'm not a politician. I'm not Nehru or Jinnah or Gandhi. These are very ordinary people. What stories do we have? But let me tell you about those Mountbattens. Let me tell you about the Unionists. Let me tell you about Suhavardi. Or they would say, well, everybody was going through the same thing. Everyone was in the camp. They were on the same journey. Sabke halat ek jaise the. Or they would say, hum to kuch nahi laye. We brought nothing. You see, for far too long, the politics of partition has overshadowed the individuality of the survivor, which means it has overshadowed their particular stories. It has blanketed them into collective stories. It has overshadowed their extraordinary losses, their cultural consequences of forced migration, and this was very evident in my interactions with people. So I would say, your story is important. I am here to listen to it. And I often travel to different cities, to different countries and continents to record it because it matters who tells the story and it matters who listens to it. As you see, and even though they knew what I had come to talk about, which is partition, and they had agreed to speak about it, it would still take us time to travel into the past because memory is not always readily offered. So they would ask, where do I begin? When they had decided to tell their story, and this happened after we spent some time together, they would ask this question, where do I begin from? So where does the story of partition begin from? More than often, it never begins at partition. It usually begins way before or way after. Because memory is rarely remembered chronologically. It comes to us in spurts, often inspired by things we see in the present or things that happen to us in the present. It is mediated internally, it is sifted. Whether the memory of partition would have emerged otherwise or not, I can't say. But I know that the object helped soften the way. It returned the survivor to a life unpartitioned, a house once inhabited, a parent once living, a sibling once living, a journey of migration. So I would say to them, begin from where you think is important. And they would think about this and they would delve into the recesses of their own stories where no two beginnings were ever the same. And I have collected a few of these beginnings for you all. So as I go through them, I want you to think about what emerges to the surface first and how different people really are. How their memory is mediated internally before it emerges. Think about the vocabulary they are using. Because many of these interviewees have not spoken to anyone about partition in a long time. And sometimes ever. I love this photograph. To me, this photograph is winter in Delhi. That's what it feels like. The house, the windows, they're so reminiscent of Delhi. The Jaipuri, the Zai, the heat, the sun. Does anyone know what Hitkari pottery is?
There was a company.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. It was a company around the same time as Bengal pottery. This is the woman who started Hitkari pottery along with her husband. And so you can see on the side there are cups. I don't know actually if you can see. On the very left side, there are some of the earliest cups of Hitkari pottery. She said to me, this is how she started her story. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see the house. And even 70 years later, in my memory, that house in Jhelum is still a home. This is Sitara Fyaz Ali. She lives in Lahore. She went to Lahore from Dalhousie. When I met her in her living room in Lahore, she said to me, "तुम आई तो सब याद आ गया. तुम आई तो हिंदुस्तान याद आ गया." Shall I translate?
Yes.
I should translate. She said that with you being being here, I now remember everything. With you being here, I remember Hindustan, which is undivided India, India for her. This is Balbir Singh Veer. He said, I was born on the other side, which is now Pakistan. And from childhood, I never learned to write any other language but Urdu. I even dream in Urdu. And this is my grandfather. He said, he was very vehement, he always said, what will you do after you know our story? What will it change? The past will still be the past, the border will still be the border. The tale of how and why we came to Delhi is not an easy one. These portraits belong to a woman called Sumoni Bhagat, and these are her parents. She said to me, and this is how she started her story of partition. Our parents taught us to look forward and not dwell in the past, and so we learned to take the partition in our stride as something normal. And then very quietly she added, which it wasn't. So how does the normalization of partition also happen in people's stories, in people's lives? Why are they forced to continue on as if what they lived through was something banal? This is one of the favorite interviews that I did. Kalyani May Chaudhary, she used to live in Calcutta, she's passed away now. She said, where you want to travel is a place of the past, and I don't know if I can return so easily. I'm old now, nearly 90, and too much time has passed. You see, at times I don't remember anymore. Other times I don't have the words to express myself, and then sometimes the past seems like an imaginary place. One of the things she said in our interview will never leave me. She said that when she migrated from Chittagong to Calcutta, obviously she carried a lot of intangible things with her, like the memory of the Brahmaputra. It's any of the interviews I did with people who lived in East Pakistan and migrated to West Bengal carried the memory of lush green scapes, the landscape, the natural world. And what she carried with her were also soil and roots, and she loved plants. So when she was migrating as a young woman with her family, she carried some of the plants she really loved. And she tried to grow those plants in Calcutta, and they didn't grow. And she said that I had to admit to myself that even plants, like people, bear allegiance to their soil. You can't simply transplant something or uproot something and transplant it in another place and expect it to grow. And I thought that was very profound and quite very emblematic of the refugee journey. So how and when is the right time for a memory or a story to emerge? Why do stories emerge and when? In June, the Punjabi poet Prabjot Kaur, who you can see on the screen with her daughter Nirupama, travelled with her family from Badami Bagh, just outside of Lahore, to Kalyan, which is near Bombay. A convoy arrived suddenly in the middle of the night to take them. The weather was sweltering, and she remembers leaving the chula on with the chapatis burning. It's funny how things stay in our minds. So this memory of the chapati burning is something she brought up again and again. I can't believe I left it. What would have happened to the house? What would have happened to the chapati? They all wore black chadars, which is black shawls. When they arrived at the train station with other refugees, they stood for 2 hours before the train arrived. They stood on the platform. There was no shuffling of refugees coming off the train. There was no chanting. There was no rioting, and for a minute, they all thought that they were safe. But the eeriness of that silence was terrifying. And once they got on the train, that they realized that everyone on it was already dead. Those who had boarded the train at the previous station had all been murdered. I found myself asking Prabjot Kaur what happened next. And this is what she said. And now, keep at the back of your mind that she's a poet and focus on her observations that have stayed in her memory, the images that cannot leave us. We had to push the corpses aside and make room to sit. We sat next to them, we sat on top of them, saath hi baithe. Pools of their blood seeped slowly into the thick cloth of our chadars, staining them. It was sickening. First, we were slinking away like thieves or robbers in the middle of the night, dressed in black clothes for fear of being seen. There was no dignity in such a flight. And then, to sit among the dead, it was sickening. The stench of blood, the body parts, the hair, the idle suitcase. Do you ever think about that train? I asked her. Before today, I have never spoken about that train, she admitted quietly. I was an idealist back then. I think we all had to be in order to survive. After everything we had witnessed in those days, one had to remain positive somehow. As the weeks went by, the smell and feel and memory of the people on that train gradually faded into forgetfulness. I never thought about it. Or maybe I just couldn't. There was no time to. Later, her daughter told me that she never knew about that train, that she had never heard that detail in her life. So why had it emerged now in our conversation? Was the time right? Was Prabjot Kaur far back enough into the past to relive everything precisely? Or had enough time passed since the event had happened? In short, when do people let go of their memories? When do they choose to unburden? Is there a moment of internal relinquishment for people? These are all questions I've asked myself over the last decade. And I feel that even though I have been privy to many such instances of people's stories, there are still reams of memory that will remain unavailable to me, unavailable to us. I have also realized that there are places in our past meant only for us. And no matter how much we intervene or others intervene, we must accept that eventually you cannot hear a story that someone does not want to tell or does not want to tell at the time. I should say that Prabjot Kaur began speaking about that time because she kept journals of poems. She wrote poetry, and that's what we used to enter into the past together. So if you can see this poem right here is dated 21st August 1947, which is exceptional for this thing to have survived and in such great condition. Unfortunately, she's not remembered as prominently as she should. She and her husband Narinder Singh are the only couple in India till date who both have won the Sahitya Academy Award, which has never happened to any other couple. So if you read Gurmukhi, you should read her. Or Russian or French. She's translated into a number of languages. This is my grandmother, and that's her holding a portrait of her mother. I once asked her if at the time of partition, whether there were oral historians or journalists like me going around asking questions, recording memory, would she have wanted to talk? I asked this with the simple assumption that she had always wanted to talk to me. So I assumed that if there had been people at the time that were asking her questions, she would have wanted to talk to them. And I was quite surprised when she immediately said no. And then she said, maybe my mother would have wanted to speak to someone. You see, my grandmother was only 16 years old, and she had 3 siblings with her at the time, and 2 siblings who were already married, and 1 who was not in Delhi when they all came to Delhi. Their mother was a single mother whose husband had died many years ago, so many of the kids actually grew up not knowing their father. So when I asked her whether it may have helped her mother lighten her heart, she said, maybe her heart would have become lighter, or maybe it would have gotten heavier. When someone asks about such a deep pain or loss, whatever is buried comes to the surface. And then it remains in the mind for a long time after the conversation is over. The person continues to think about it and it can consume them. You come here and you ask your questions and then you go. And then I am left in that time. And suddenly I think of how many times I've asked my grandmother to go back to that time, to return to the days of partition, of their migration to Delhi, of the homelessness, the joblessness, of the camps, of the ration, her brother dying, of the insurmountable loss that those days would have brought them. And so I ask her now, is that what happens to you when I ask about partition? You continue to think about it after I leave. That is what happens, she confirms. And because I'm so taken aback by this answer, also it comes from this huge difference in generations where a generation like mine assumes that everyone wants to speak, and a generation like hers assumes that one will speak when the time is right, or there may be no need to speak about things. So I'm so taken aback because by this point we've been talking about partition for 8 or 9 years, which is a long time. So I ask her, should I not ask you anymore? Would you rather not speak about it? So there is silence, and eventually she says to me, I'm not saying that you shouldn't ask. You should ask. You should ask because no one has asked this way. At some point she said to me, she was quite disturbed by how obsessed I was about partition. So she said, I didn't think that anyone in my family would know what a partition is or bring it up at all in the future. She says, you should know what happened at the time. But remembering is difficult and wanting to remember is harder. Perhaps harder than wanting to forget even. To continue to remember the things that happened to you is harder to forget about them. And I hold this conversation close to me when I think about what it means for a story to be told and what it takes out of the person telling the story. And I live on the border of guilt always, wondering, am I doing more harm asking about the story, or does the story need to emerge for posterity? And of course it's case by case. Now I want to end this presentation by speaking about the reconciliatory power of sharing personal memories of events like partition. Popular media has long perpetuated and reinforced the idea of stark dichotomy between communities, good versus bad, us versus them, and this doesn't just happen with partition, it happens on an everyday basis, non-Muslim versus Muslim, but the reality is far more complex because an event like partition resulted in multi-hyphenated identities. So the survivor's memory is not black or white. The survivor's memory of that time is not vague or sweeping. It is very nuanced, it is very detailed. It helps us to imagine migrations, study differences from the western and eastern border, to think about the impact of divided families, of friends, of businesses, of partners, allow us to believe that despite violence being the background, all people were not violent. And until there isn't a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, these personal vignettes will help us gain a nuanced access into that time, so that stories that are passed down the generations are not just ones of hate and othering, or violence or suffering, but of survival and strength. I know that there is power in the human voice, in voicing memory, which can lead to these intimate, very minor reconciliations, personal reconciliations, and I want to end with one such story. So, if you remember, I showed this photograph of this lady earlier. Her name is Sitara Fiaz Ali, and she lives in Lahore. She migrated from Dalhousie in India, but she lived in many different places before that, including Gurgaon, which was like a village at the time with cornfields and monkeys. Next to her is her father. His name is, oh my god, it'll come to me. Anyway, he was the first Muslim Vice Chancellor of Punjab University, and he was a huge advocate for women's education. When I come to her in Lahore, she tells me that she has these utensils that she wants to talk about, and she talks about the utensils, but basically for 5 minutes. She says, yes, My mother-in-law gave me these utensils in my jahez, which is in my trousseau for my wedding, and they're really beautiful, and they are very beautiful. Does anyone want to guess what this one is? On the right? Out loud? An ashtray? No? Anyone else? Yeah.
Is this spittoon?
Oh, no, it's very tiny. No, guys, it's an egg holder. Exactly. It's very fancy. Beautiful. But she doesn't really want to talk about these things. She just wants to show me and then she's done with that. What she wants to talk about is this house. She wants to talk only about this house, which is called Kehkishan. And in Urdu, the word Kehkishan means galaxy. Mia Afzal Hussain was her father's name. So Mia Afzal Hussain built this house with his hands. And it is shaped very weirdly because in parts it's a round house like an observatory. The ceilings have stars on them, and this is all Sitara Fiaz Ali telling me. Her name is Sitara. So she shows me this black and white photograph, which is the last photograph she took before she left the house in 47, which is in Dalhousie. And the colored photograph is from the 50s, where a family friend went, and he was able to photograph the outside of the house, but not the inside because it was locked. And he asked around, and he said, "Ki ab wahan pe kaun rehta hai? Who lives there now?" And he was told that 2 Sikh brothers lived in that house. Now, when I was writing my first book, I wrote Mrs. Ali's story in the book, and I wrote about this house, but only very, very in passing. I wrote that she had a house called Kehkishan in Dalhousie that her father built, and now it is inhabited by 2 Sikh brothers. These are the brothers. I found this photograph much later, after I met them. So the book is published. See, they're holding it in their hands. 1 month after the book is published, one of the brothers, my parents own a small bookshop in Delhi, and I had made a mention of the bookshop in this book. So because this man didn't know me, he came to my parents' bookshop, and he basically came in and he was very, very upset, and not just upset, like just really anxious. And my mother was there, and he's holding this book, and he's saying, "I need to speak to this lady who's written this book." And my mother thinks that I've offended him, obviously, because that's one of the main things that happens when you write about partition. She says, "Sir, I'm really sorry, please have a seat, let me get you some water." "What is it? Tell me." He says, "I need to speak to this woman. She's written about this house in Dalhousie called Kehkishan." "Yes, I live in this house, this is my house." My mother phones me and she says, "There's a man saying that he lives in this house." I think I just started crying. And I called Mrs. Ali in Pakistan and I said, "I found your house." I want to say that when you work on events that are so far back in the past, and partition is really not so far back in the past, but it does render landscapes inaccessible because of the militarized border. So when you work on events like this, you never actually think something is going to happen. When you help someone connect with something they have lost. I start crying. I called her up. I said, "I found your house." And she says, "Oh, I hope they take some photographs for us." She's so sweet. I said, "They're going to do more than that, trust me." So I make a meeting with them. I meet these 2 brothers, and they are telling me their stories of how they came to live in this house. So this is them as children. They migrated from Rawalpindi after the famous rape of Rawalpindi in April 47, March, April 47. They come and they get this property, Kehkishan, as exchange in a claim. For those of you that don't know what a claim is, if you lost something on one side, you would put in a claim with the Department of Rehabilitation, and they would give you either agricultural land or private land that is residential, you can choose, and it would usually be the equivalent value if they could give it, and if you could prove that that's what you were left behind. So they get this in a claim, and I invite myself to the house. And they're really taken aback because they don't know me. But I've written this book, so obviously I know a little bit, and they trust me somehow enough to say, "Yes, please come live with us." As I'm driving up to Dalhousie, and it takes quite a while to drive up from Delhi, I think the thing that was going on in my head was that the house will not be the same. You know, something that was built in 47 can't look the same. I have to prepare myself that I may be disappointed. I wasn't. Look at that. It's stunning. It's beautiful and it's unchanged. I stood at the threshold of this house at the gate and I felt like I don't even know what I felt like history had melted into the present. And I wish that I could have brought Mrs. Ali with me, you know, because she would have recognized every part of this house. So the brothers are telling me how after they got the house, a few years after partition, they themselves by hand repainted the green paint because they wanted to retain that finish. And they kept the stars on the ceiling and the rounded living room because that was how Afzal Hussain had wanted the house to be. They even kept the name plate. They said, well, what if someone comes looking for it? While I'm in Dalhousie, it dawns on me that this is a house built during the British Raj, which means that the likelihood of Afzal Hussain having to deposit his documents through the municipal office is pretty likely to gain permission, because it's very difficult, as you know, here building in the hills. You have to take permission for everything: water, sewer, toilet, kitchen, everything. So I go to the municipal office and I beg the clerk that I want to find the maps, the blueprints, the file of these houses belonging to Afzal Hussain. And the clerk dismisses me in a very clerk-like fashion, saying, "Madam, aapko ab kahan milega?" And he leads me to this room, which is filled to the brim with papers and files and dust and cobwebs. And he says, "Milega to dekh lo, like if you can find it, then you'll find it here." And he's standing, he's not helping really. It's me and somebody from this Bedi family, the Sikh family. We're going through all these files, and by the evening we find this file. File number 123, Buildings of M. Afzal Hussain. And I feel like, I don't know, it feels incredible. It feels like you've come across a treasure or something, and the treasure doesn't belong to you, but you're really, really happy to have found it. And in this file are plans for the building, but letters. Letters that Afzal Hussain wrote, copious letter writer. I had submitted the plan for the construction of a double-storied house on the upper Bakrota some 3 years back. He's writing this in 41, so he's been planning this since 1938. It takes time to build a house in the hills. A portion of this house, in fact the main house, was built last year, so he's building slowly. And this house is named Kehkeshan. He has to ask permission for everything. Can I remove 4 fern trees? Can I remove this rock? I need to make an extension for my kitchen. I need to make a servant quarter. So I start taking photographs of these plans, these letters, his signature, and I send them back to Lahore. And you see how incredible the blueprint is of the house. It's so stunning. And then I come across the final letter. It's written on 12th of May 1947 and May, June, July, August, 4 months before partition. I am sending here with the printed application form duly signed by Khan Bahadur Mia M. Afzal Hussain in regard to the kitchen that he proposes to construct for his residence Kehkeshan at Upper Bakrota, Dalhousie. He's planning an extension. This is 4 months before partition. There is no plan to leave. Despite violence in the Punjab, there is no plan to leave. Dalhousie fell under Gurdaspur district, which at the time of partition was 51% Muslim and so assumed by a lot of people to have fallen in Pakistan. Quite like this Malda actually, on this side. Both Malda and Dalhousie raised the Pakistani flag, and then 3 days later, when they realized that they were going to be in India, they had to raise the Indian flag. In Malda, I think Independence Day is still celebrated on 16th or 17th, something like that. So, being a Muslim family, Mrs. Ali's family thought they were in Pakistan, no problem. And then come the 17th, they realized actually they're on the wrong side of the border and they have to leave. And so they leave. And they leave everything behind, whatever they can take, they take. Obviously, they can't take the house. The real reason for being there, of course, is to get the families to talk. And I realize when I get them on a call, what are the kinds of things that you think they were talking about? Like if you were one of these families, what would you have wanted to ask the other? This is an interactive question. See the house, yes, of course. What else? Plants is great, yes. But think of like far more nuanced things. In the bedroom, there is a writing desk. And there is a secret message in that desk. Who carved that? Who made that extension of the dining table? Isn't it really cumbersome? In the summer, why don't you come and stay at our house and we can spend it together in Kehkashan? That's what the Bedi family said to the Ali family. And I realized that it wasn't a Sikh family talking to a Muslim family or an Indian family talking to a Pakistani family. It was micro reconciliation. It was two families that shared a history of a house, brought together by a book, very unlikely. And I think that if government bodies do not partake in reconciliation efforts on a larger national, transnational level, then it rests on people like artists and musicians and oral historians and psychologists and storytellers make those efforts to exhume memory. And I will end my presentation here and welcome any questions.
Thank you very much for a very elegant and evocative talk. Of course, I couldn't help thinking of Urvashi Kutalia's book, The Sound of Silence. I mean, it's hard to kind of ask questions because your talk, I think for me at least, evokes reflections or maybe emotional responses, not so much questions as such. I was just struck by some of the questions that you raised, which don't have easy answers. I mean, or any answers, yes. I mean, in terms of when the people you interviewed or the people you've met, including your own grandparents, when they ask you why do you want to know, right, or what use it, or the kind of the consequences of having to answer a question when they really have to answer it. And I think when you very rightly said that the power of, I mean, it's harder to forget than to remember, and so when you actually do evoke a memory, it seems that they really have to, in some sense, relive the same pain and suffering. And it gets really hard to then let go of the lingering feeling of displacement and loss. I was also struck by I mean, there are many kind of impressions I had. I mean, I was thinking of some novels that I have read and got. I was thinking also of the Underground Railroad, where yes, I mean, I was when you're talking about plants, I remember that the protagonist there carrying okra seeds from which her mother had given her, and which she never actually ends up. I mean, she does plant them, but I'm not sure what relationship they have to because here you say that it's not easy or it's not possible to transplant something and grow something like that.
But keep in mind that every individual response is an individual
yes.
response, right? So where you have Tita, I call her Tita because her grandkids call her Tita. Tita says that I can't plant these plants from Chittagong. There are also people who carry far more bitter memories of the natural world. Like there were interviewees who, when they were migrating, tied up corn seeds in their dupattas because they didn't know when they would eat next. And those corn seeds came to represent migration, so they don't eat corn anymore. Or people who were hiding out in a house at some point for 25 days only had yellow chane ki dal, because chane ki dal is like, not chane ki dal, black, there's chickpeas and then there's black, dal, what is it, yeah, some kind of dal that's high in protein. and that's what they ate kacha, raw, because they couldn't cook it, because they were in hiding. And so every time this is cooked in their house, they think of the migration. Or there are the borderland itself. I always think of the natural world as the borderland, where one tree goes across into the other side, or the birds that fly, or in many cases on the eastern border where rivers are borders, you know. So what nationality do the natural elements of the world ascribe to? Every response is different.
Or the fact that this is a very nice moment when the Sikh family, they decide to actually preserve the house and respect the other's memories. That was very nice.
It happens more often than you think. I would really say don't go by Bollywood's perception of partition or the news. This stuff happens way more often than you think with the advent of social media. I recorded another story about a gentleman who migrated from Jalandhar to Lahore, and before he migrated from Jalandhar, in the years that the partition riots were really that really started to take shape, him and his brother hid out in a house in Aligarh called Mili Chhatri, and I wrote about it in my first book. And recently there was a lady on a flight reading that book, and she read that there was a woman called Begum Abad who owned Mili Chhatri, who had given pana or safety to this interviewee of mine. And she wrote to me, she said, I was reading your book on this flight and I burst into tears because Begum Abad was my grandmother. And it was incredible seeing her name in this book that I didn't know anything about, and this man who I didn't know. And so then she took the contact of that man in Pakistan and then went to Pakistan to meet him to say that we share this memory of my grandmother and Mili Chhatri. And these things are very common.
Okay, thank you so much. We can open it up now for questions. Maybe, yes.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah. So, firstly, I like again the partition experiences that you are talking about, whatever was there in this presentation, except for one narrative. Most of it was concentrated in the Western frontier. Yeah. There is one narrative which was about a person who had migrated from Chittagong, I guess, to Kolkata. Now now.
But the majority of my work is not just about
Yeah.
Punjab, if that's what you're going to ask.
Oh, no, no, no. That is not my question. My question is the people who you have been interviewing as a part of these projects of partition in different parts of the world. Are these only people who belong to the property classes? So people who belong to the social elites, and even after partition, they had some sort of their social realities at some degree of social capital to which
No,
they
not necessarily. No.
Okay. Because why I am asking this is that in the case of say Bengal or Assam, you are talking about the memory, the remembrance, how it is not seen as an individual sort of a remembrance, like you were suggesting. That individually how they felt because of the partition, they don't want to share that. But then again on the eastern frontier, there might be a very political reasoning behind that as well.
Agreed. And also the migration on the eastern border was far more prolonged over the course of decades.
There was no exchange of population unlike the western frontier.
It was ongoing.
Yeah, it was ongoing, exactly. And it is still, you can say it's ongoing, and the politics is much more complicated than how it is in the western frontier. So, most of the presentation that you gave is through a lot of huge role is that a huge part is being played by the tangible object. But for the majority of the people who had crossed over, who had exchanged their house, their places in the society,
They may not
different-
have
yeah,
objects.
they may not have objects. So in that case, because I come from a family where my grandparents, they had migrated sometime around 1955, they also have, there is a pivotal role of objects like it is there in these presentations. My grandfather has memoirs written in 3 volumes of his experience, and it's not a very, like you suggested, it's not a very black and white experience. Again, if you read between the lines, there is a lot of politics that comes out of that as well, how to perceive which community. The problem here is that, but the most of the narratives, which we often, as academicians, as historians, we tend to negate, is the narratives of the non-property classes. So how do they remember partition? And it is vastly different when I go to the field, when I ask people their memories of partition. It is very there is a huge role of the current political movements and whatever is happening with the regime. That plays a very pivotal role. So yeah, that was precisely my question, that property classes, they do talk about the perspective of reconciliation, but then again, what about the non-property classes or
Reconciliation is not only for property classes.
I mean,
But why isn't there reconciliation?
Yeah.
Let's look at that. You tell me, why do you think there is no
I
reconciliation?
mean, there can be a lot of it. It is again very regional in nature. The factors behind it's both. There is geopolitical factors as well as very regional and local factors as well responsible. So again, if you look at Silhet and how the issue has been politicized after the 90s and currently with the regime change and everything, that micro level, those sorts of management and the coming of the right-wing BJP. So a lot of factors.
And similar things can
Yeah.
be seen in places like Sindh or places like Kashmir
Absolutely.
that are struggling since partition to hold on to multiple identities, regional, ethnic identities. But the process of truth and reconciliation comes in an order. Those words come in an order for a reason. Truth and reconciliation. When there is acceptance of truth, can there be an effort for reconciliation? When there are multiple truths, when Pakistan, India and Bangladesh and then majority subgroups, minority subgroups cannot decide on what 47 means, what 71 means, what 65 means, when there are multiple truths and non-acceptance of each other's truth, how can we ever move on to the process of understanding, accepting and reconciling? It will not happen. It may not happen in your and my lifetime. I worked on objects with the assumption that the interviewees that I interview have objects. Right? One partition scholar cannot do everything, right? You must also pick up the things that you think are lacking in my work or other people's work. It's taken me a long time to accept how to say this thing. But I'm saying that one person can't do everything, so if you think something is lacking, and if you think there are communities that I have not interviewed, by the way, I've written 3 books on this subject, this is just 45 minutes, you must do the work. You must do that work. Because the work can't stop. Right?
Thank you. That was my question.
Thank you for the talk. My question kind of resonates with what Dilip just asked, so I will repeat all of that. But I think it's not a question of one person doing all the work. But the point is, you exercise kind of a political caution when you said the history is not all about Mountbattens, but also history can be told through personal narratives and objects. That's a kind of a methodological take also, which is very, very relevant. So, and that is also very political in the sense that it is not all about the people, the examined lives or, bigger events, but also about smaller events. That also involves questions of power, where you exercise that caution, which doesn't come across as, which doesn't get reflected in your selection of respondents. And it is important to acknowledge that fact. What kind of collective memory are you constructing through these kinds of personal narratives? It is not to say that okay, you have to be representative of all the communities and all the classes, but it is important to acknowledge the social location and the situated of the respondents that you are talking about. I assume that what these were the definitions, and then so I think that is important. It's not merely for the sake of representation, but it's important to acknowledge the social locations of the respondents and the kind of memory and the collective memory that they're articulating. I think that's important, even if we can't do every
But it is
thing.
acknowledged. It is acknowledged. In, like I said, it. This is a 45
No,
minute
I was also
presentation.
responding to how, like, you were saying that one person
Yes.
can't do all the
And
work.
they can't. So there will always be things that are missing, and there will always be acknowledgements in the text themselves. You only have access to certain number of people. I feel like
So in your respondents, you also
Yes.
have people from other classes, non-property class.
absolutely.
Okay.
But this is a work of 12 long years.
Yeah, and can you tell any one narrative about somebody from the non-property class and how they thought about objects?
They did not have objects.
Yeah, but what
They
did they thought?
remembered things other ways.
Like how did they remember partition, if I may ask?
I remember a story of a man that I interviewed in Karachi, Azim Saab. See, this is not cherry picking narratives. Can you tell me this? Can you tell me
Yeah.
that? You also must acknowledge this. Azim Saab talked about his childhood in Calcutta as a Muslim, before partition, after partition. After partition, he migrated to East Pakistan, from where he migrated to Pakistan proper, lives in Karachi. What reminded him of partition, because he had no objects, were paper boats. Because he built those in his childhood, migrating via boats to these various areas. I don't have an image of a boat to show you, but I remember him talking about that boat, and that story is very much in my books. And other people like that as well. So it's a bit unfair to assume that because I'm showing you objects, because that was the premise of the project I worked on, that all the people I spoke to had objects.
Yeah, people without objects is what perhaps also was I was thinking of when you were talking about partition.
But when
People
the
without-
premise of the project was the material artifacts, and you look at people who have
Then
material
people
artifacts,
also get treated as objects. People without objects also get treated as objects
I suppose, yes. Not
Yeah.
always.
many times.
She had a question.
So, when you're talking about a family who have, drastically, like in their journey, they have covered in during partition from, Dalhousie to Lahore, or maybe a family that moved from Lahore to, let's say, Delhi, this huge span of distance kind of allows them a sort of forgetting, which allows them, to kind of go back to that memory, right? So there's a certain sense of forgetting in a way, and then you can again maybe after 50 years go back to that.
But can you describe what you mean by forgetting?
Forgetting, by forgetting I mean I use the word very loosely, is primarily not, as you were talking, that they had not spoken about
Active
this.
remembering.
Yeah,
sure.
active remembering, right? But in places where the borders are much more porous, for example in Bengal, where you were just on the other bank of the river and you just moved to this bank. You were still having the same fish, your diet is still the same. Also, another way of remembering by people who did not have objects is food, right? So how you are still having the same food, you are still wearing the same thing, you still speak in the same dialect and so on. So how do you think, or also there are ways of years of moving from 1 year. So they're moving once 47, then 71. Maybe they still have a family there. So there's accessibility to that pind or to the particular homestead. So a refugee family who has suffered partition but has a very easy access to that homestead. How do they forget and how do they remember, and how is that significantly different from a family in Punjab that has moved in the last 70 years and has never gone back? How are these two different?
I mean, they're hugely different, right? Firstly, the fortification of the border on the west was far more immediate, and access to the other side was limited almost immediately in 47, 48. Apart from if you were a divided family, you may get a visa to see your family, and there was an India-Pakistan passport for that. But on the eastern side, where the migration was continuous. The border is far more porous, not just for goods but also people, as you said, going back and forth. I think remembrance is also, the porosity of remembrance is multiplied that much more, where remembrance is constant and the border is a burden, but the border is also comfort. I remember an interview that I did with a family, a son and his mother, where the family continued to go back and forth and own property in what became East Pakistan and later became Bangladesh for years, for decades in fact. Since after 47, they kept moving back and forth until 1992, 93. So major events in India or Bangladesh that maybe had nothing to do with them per se also inspired swaths of migration of people, and it's very interesting to see what that does to the psychology of a person. What do they become anxious? Does the family constantly become anxious? Can anxiety live alongside longing? Like the matriarch of this family wanted to die in what was Bangladesh because that's where she was from. But because she was paralyzed and in West Bengal, they couldn't possibly airlift her there for her to die in Bangladesh. And this became a grievance of her life. That I want to die there, I want to die there. There is obviously attachment to soil and land in a way that is indescribable, that exists on both sides. But I think maybe you're right. On the western side, I wouldn't say forgetfulness, but I would say that it is mediated by, I don't know, by the knowledge that you can't surpass that border. It's so difficult. It's so difficult, right? The visa is so difficult. People on the Punjab side, or even the Sindh, like let's not forget the border goes all the way from Kashmir to Sindh. People in Sindh, Hindu Sindhis, have reconciled with the fact that they may never see their homeland again, which is separated from them, which is actually, like, I was thinking of the comparison between Hindu Sindhis and Hindu Siletis. Similar, like statelessness, lost homeland, but they think about that a lot as well. So I feel like there is mentally such a difference between the East and the West, which is reflected in the literature that comes out. You know, and I think maybe the porosity and accessibility of that landscape, that, like you said, if it's just on the other side of the riverbank, it's so close. But then the river itself becomes the border in many cases on this side. You know?
We have time for one more question. Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the very insightful conversation. In the beginning, you said that it was difficult for you to figure out what questions to ask. I'm sure that since the work has been for like over 10 years, you have built a repository of questions. Please, can you give us some insights into what went into developing that question bank, like a different, like over the course of the past decade? Like, if you can give some insight into what thought you put in and how you built that question.
So, I don't know if I should be embarrassed or not, but I don't have a written questionnaire for, I don't use a written questionnaire. I learned very early on that I didn't want to limit every person to the same set of questions because it may not apply to them. So what I do is, if I'm going to interview somebody, I find out where they came from and where they went to. And I usually begin with when I arrive at somebody's house, we usually spend a little time getting to know each other. And I usually begin from childhood. I would ask them, what's the most important memory from your childhood that you remember? What did you do as a child? What class were you in? What did you wear? How did you make your hair? What was your mother like? What was the food that you used to eat? And I think this helps, whether or not anyone has an object, this helps to build social ethnography. So you're not only focusing on the moment of partition itself as an isolated incident, but you're looking at how a life was lived up till then, how an event of partition or any other migration fractured that life and how that life was lived after. So what I try and do is build the landscape of how someone used to live. And it's very interesting, the responses, if someone was a child when they migrated versus if someone was an adult. And I'll give you an example. I was interviewing a lady who had migrated from Quetta to Mussoorie. Quetta is a very cold place. It was in the mountains. It's like known as, I think, like the Switzerland of Pakistan or something, or maybe that's Mali, I don't know, it's very cold. And she said that, I remember, she was only 5 when she migrated, so she says that I remember on one side there was a gurdwara and it was so big, and then I remember on the other side there was a mosque and it was so big, and maybe I remember them to be so big because I was so small. And then another gentleman who migrated from Jalandhar said that I think some 30 years after partition, he was able to return back to Jalandhar to see his house. And he said that I remember the distance from the railway station to my home being very long when I used to live there. But now when I came, it was barely 5 minutes. So distances also seemed very long when you're a very young child. I try and ask people, I guess, about the everyday more than, tell me about the violence of partition. And we do arrive at that violence, or we do arrive at that migration, but we do so after quite a bit of time, unless that's what they want to talk about first. Some people are more willing to talk about that than others, which is also why you have to gauge the person a little bit, which is why I didn't keep a questionnaire, I think with every interview you learn how to ask better questions, and more importantly, you learn to ask questions in the native language of the person if you can. That's very important, which means at times you may take a translator with you, or a family member may translate as you're sitting. It's also quite interesting to have family members sitting because they may interject and add parts of the story, which makes for a multi-layered generational narrative.
The reason I asked this question was because you said at some point you felt some questions are like off limits. So hence I asked the question.
The questions, you see, like when you're starting, you don't know anything. Like the questions I thought were off limits were very stupid now. Like, can I use the word Pakistan? Will they be offended by this word Pakistan? Can I use the word refugee? Are they still refugees? These kinds of things, because you don't know, like that vocabulary isn't second nature to you, right? And you're also figuring out, and for the longest time, the vocabulary of partition has been a vocabulary of silence. And only now in recent years, since oral history work by Urushi or Ritu Menon or people like that, has vocabulary started to be built, but also the acknowledgement that all vocabulary is not verbal, right? You mentioned food, I think. Food is a very important vocabulary for people, gestures, the pauses, why people switch languages when they talk to you, these kinds of things. You learn to pick these up the more interviews you do, I hope that answers your question.
Finally, the most awaited moment of the conference, the announcement for the Best Paper Award. I request Ms. Anchal to kindly present the best paper and the cash prize to our presenters. So we have Anvesha Sahu from School of Humanities and Social Sciences Management, IIT.
getting in, but we had earlier announced that there would be one best paper, but our judging committee sat through all the papers and there was a consensus that we should have two best paper awards. So which is why we are announcing two best paper awards now. And our judging committee also came forward with two papers that should have a special mention. So Anvesha Sahu is, her paper is titled Traversing the Amnesiac City, Gendered Mobility in Taran Khan's memoir Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. Actually, I wanted Anchal to do this announcement. So if, yeah, so I think this is the second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The second best paper goes to Shushoban Mahata from the Department of Economics, University of Calcutta, Kolkata. The title of the paper is Media Democracy and Globalization, a micro-theoretic model of politics of perception. The next two papers are special mentions. The first is Sayadali Najib from Department of Philosophy, Kerala University, Thiruvananthapuram. And the title of the paper is Against Transcendental Delusion, Situatedness of Epistemic Agents. And the second is Gunjan Joshi, Cognitive Experimental Laboratory, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Indore, and the paper is Negative Content Increases False Recall in Semantic Associates.
Are they not here? Yeah, so the best paper award is so each of them are awarded with a cash prize of 5,000 each and a certificate. So congratulations. I think Anvesha was here, right?
Yeah. I now humbly request Dr. Kiran to do the honors of felicitating Anjal Malhotra. I would now like to invite the student convener of the graduate research meet, whose hard work and dedication have been instrumental in making this event a success. Please join me in welcoming Amritesh Kumar Jha to the stage.
Thank you, Mohani. A very good afternoon, everyone. It's an overwhelming feeling for me as I stand here to conclude GRM 2024. There are so many individuals to thank that Ronnie and I have decided to share the responsibility. I'll start by thanking our keynote and endnote speakers for accepting our invitation and speaking on such pertinent theme like memory in the context of Israel and Palestine or from the lens of partition. Thank you for making time for us despite your busy schedule. Next are participants, without whom the event wouldn't have been possible, coming from all corners of the country. It is not cakewalk, and I must thank you all from the bottom of my heart for making this happen. Now I thank our esteemed panel chairs who immerse themselves in the sessions to give valuable comments and suggestions to the presenters. Our motto and vision is to be as inclusive as possible with regard to scholarly engagement, and we are pleased to acknowledge that this year we had presenters from different universities ranging from Punjab to Gujarat to Pondicherry to Sikkim and so on and so forth. The research paper presented dealt with wide-ranging themes under the purview of humanities and social sciences. The panels were constituted based on the abstract we had received. Few of the panel themes might have overlapped with each other, which were possibly due to the numerous research papers based on similar ideas. However, we will try to amend this in future. Now, coming to the GRM 24 organizing committee, like I mentioned in my welcome address also, we constituted different committees to implement and perform different tasks. And I cannot thank enough for looking after smooth organization of the event, except some minor microphone hiccups that we acknowledge. Okay, where do I start from? Guys, please wave us at as I call your names. First of all, our GRM faculty convener, Professor Rashri Begmata, whose continuous support will us to conclude the GRM as a success. Now I'd like to call committee head names. In abstract, Priyanka, Pritam, who is not here but he is watching this session live on his phone. In logistics, we have Sonia and Suresh here. Stationery committee had Fahim and Rishita. Finance head Nilandana and Ashish. Oh, I think he is behind. Oh, yeah. Hall management John and Rubino. They both have worked very hard to make everything happen as organized and very smoothly. Our email correspondents Nilotpal and Siddharth, and we also have Meghna. So these are the guys whose circadian rhythm I was talking about on my welcome address. Pre-GRM coordinators Shivani and Jannat, whose hard work helped us to implement all the 5 pre-GRM events very successfully. Our PR head Ejaz and Jannat, Priyanka Mundra. Oh, and again my favorite food committee, Orko. You can see that this is like everyone's favorite. Anmol and Yogesh were also in the food committee. Our anchoring head Upasna and Muhammad. Our co-convener Ronit Hazarika. Now I would like to call Ronit to thank all whom I left.
I'll do that and more. As you can see, this can be a paper submission in itself. But yeah, towards the end, as the end note speech was being delivered, I creeped up to Amritesh and I asked him, how do we do justice to all the people who were involved? Because I had a list of all the people who were involved in various capacities, and in total it came to 127 people. I'm like, I can't possibly name all of these people. So what we'll do is we'll give a generic thank you because the thanks is from the student community, the scholar community as a whole. But of course, this would have had divided our opinions, and I think this was one of the strengths of working with someone like Amritesh. We are never afraid to contradict each other very openly, and to my best belief, I think this has worked to the favor of GRM. Anyway, we are approaching the end of GRM 2024, but of course, before we disperse, we must express our wholehearted gratitude to everyone who made this event possible. Irrespective of the scale of such a multidisciplinary event, it requires the coming together of many competencies, skills, and motivations. First, we must thank the administration of IIT Guwahati for providing the opportunity and the infrastructure to conduct an event that was entirely planned by students and scholars, of course helped and bulwarked by our esteemed faculty. GRM was started by our scholar predecessors 10 years ago, many of whom we have never met, many of whom whose names we don't know, but whose legacy we nevertheless have the good fortune to carry forward. We must thank the participants of previous GRMs as well. If not for their enthusiastic participation, we may not have had the courage to accept the passed baton. The organizing committee would only take up the task because the previous organizing committee members held our hand. Upasna Hazarika, Pranamika Doimari, who were the former convener and co-convener, and the rest of the 2023 GRM committee, thank you. Shuttling back and forth between the conference hall and the research labs to hold ad hoc meetings at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the night, way past the hours at what we had expected at the lab, required the generous help of security staff. Was it Varsha who was a co-convener? I'm so sorry for that error. As you can see, this is the strength of having two conveners, that we can correct each other all the time. I'm so sorry, Varsha, for that. Anyway, but thanks extended to Pranamika nonetheless, because time and again she chimed in with her. Huh? No, Upasna, yes, but I thank Pranamika, right? I think that thanks is deserved. Wait, so Upasna has a... Pranamika was the convener. I think we can clearly see who's the weaker of the two conveners. Anyway, moving forward. Thank you to the security staff of the Department of HSS for tolerating our very flippant and whimsical bunch, constantly shuttling from one room to another. Our meetings lasting until late nights were kept going by successive cups of lal chai, gakhir sah, and coffee. Thank you to Bulenda, Tonkesoda, and Nilumonida for never letting a single throat parch. If one person from the HSS department were to be characterized as indispensable, it would have to be Mr. Rubul Gogoi. From mass mails to the IIT community, to booking rooms and halls, to designing the website, recording sessions as he's doing right now, and coordinating between the administration and scholars, he was part of every single stage of GRM. Half the time we were left worrying how we would convince Rubul to do this because he's already encumbered by so many duties, but every single time he stepped up to the task. If our collective efforts were examined closely, his contribution would probably be the biggest of all. Durgada, Nondesorda, Uza, Chayanika, and other members of the HSS office, your tolerance knows no bounds. You helped us above and beyond what was required of you and guided us every time we were at a loss. Thank you. To the Dean of Industrial Interaction and Special Initiatives, thank you for greenlighting our event. To the Establishment Section and Estate Office, a big thank you for providing accommodation, despite being flooded by requests from 6 other parallel conferences that are happening as we speak at this campus right now. To the Hostel Affairs Board, thank you so much for accommodating our participants without any charge. It eased our budgeting considerably, and GRM benefited that much more from it. To Horadhonda, thank you for providing cab services. To Mr. Diganto Borua and delicious caterers for the wholesome meals served free of hiccups. Thanks to Jituda for providing bedding and convenience items. A big wide thanks to Lohit Hostel and Subansiri Hostel for cooperating with arriving participants with grace and patience. We call it a student initiative, but none of it would be possible if our faculty did not graciously volunteer to lend their critical eye to paper submissions and judiciously choose the most promising, as well as moderating the sessions, as we've all seen. Professor Urupchudi Soikia, Professor Lisa Das, Dr. Mithilesh Kumar Jha, Dr. Bhaskar Jyotinyo, Professor Pahi Soikia, Professor Rajshri Vedamutta, Professor Naveen Kashyap, Professor Dilwar Hussain, Dr. John Thomas, Professor Anamika Barua, Professor Rohini Mokashi Punekar, Dr. Visakh Subha, Dr. Abhishek Kashyap, Dr. Gamjahau Kipken, Dr. Devapriya Basu, Dr. Vipul Datta, Dr. Kiran Keshav Murthy, Dr. Amarti Mahanta, Professor Vidisha Som, Dr. Bodhisattva Sen Gupta, Professor Minal Kanti Datta, Professor Prabhu Venkatraman, Professor Priyanku Sharma, RHOD, Dr. Rituparna Padgiri, Professor Shakuntala Mohanto and Professor Soumya Ray, a big thank you. Being a faculty convener can be, we can imagine, a tricky business. One has to let the scholars at the helm of GRM make their own mistakes and yet ensure that they don't run off a cliff with bad ideas. Professor Rajshri Bedamatta, we believe, as the core organizing committee, played this role with enormous grace, foresight, and sensitivity. On behalf of all scholars, we express our deepest gratitude. Thank you. In his role as the HOD, Professor Priyank Sharma has earned a well-deserved reputation for frank speech, a very cooperative spirit, and exceptional approachability. Sir, from the student and scholar community, thank you for guiding us through our organization. We were fortunate to have as part of our student community, Ms. Pranayana Sharma. Pranayana, is she here? Yeah, she's here. Who has a background in film studies, so we thought why not exploit her talent to make a very short series of video clips of GRM, which unfortunately could not be finished in time, which would have continued interviews with scholars and faculty and clips from GRM itself, which is why we were going around pestering a lot of the participants with interviews and roundtable conferences and whatnot. The idea is that this will serve as institutional memory for future editions of GRM. The video series will be out in a month as post-production is underway, I trust. Thank you, Priyanana, for making this possible. And as soon as those video clips are ready, we'll share it with the entire community as well as the participant list. For our pre-GRM sessions, we thank Mr. Ajmal Razak, our own scholar, Mr. Jyotirmoy Talukdar, Mr. Ayush Singhal, Mr. Jyotishman Mudiyar, and Dr. Bikash Das, who was also part of our scholar fraternity, for their excellent talks and workshops, which our master's students, I believe, benefited massively from. Expecting master's students to help out for an academic conference during holidays is a big ask. Nevertheless, they were here. Monmayuri, Jannat, Ojaswini, Violina, Kessi, Madhav, Swarsita, Priya. There is a Priyanka as well, Priyanka Mundra. Mahashweta, Parthika, Krishna, Dhanya, Pratiti, Sudhir, Akshay, Deepshikha, Udakshri, Bandita, Rajshri, Tanya, Umesh, Rishikesh, Soumyadeep, Subrajit, Nikhil, Jyotilparna, and Akhil. So all the people that some of our participants had mentioned who were very cordial and very welcoming and very cooperative, these are the people to thank. Thank you to the scholars of the Department of HSS for their enduring involvement in the organization of GRM. I recall the fierce debates that took place as we set out to form a committee and selected themes. Some of those fierce debaters are here today. And how new debates and contentions sprung up at every stage. We try to stay clear of noise when we can because we're busy as scholars. But noise, I believe, and I trust that many of us believe, is the crucible of democracy. And I, for one, am proud to belong to a fraternity where we confront contradictions just as well as we offer them. It is this crucible in which GRM took shape. Whenever the core, under quotes, core organizing committee of 9 teams, abstract, PR, logistics, hall management, stationery, finance, the pre-GRM team, stationery, and of course, food. Whenever we needed help from any scholar who wasn't part of the formal team, they stepped up. In the end, the conception of a core team became redundant. We have, like I mentioned, 127 scholars in our department, and they all participated in some capacity. So in that sense, they are all core. Nevertheless, Ajaz, Anmol, Ashish, Fahim, Meghna, Mohaimin, Dilutpal, Nilanjana, Pritam, Priyanka, Rabino, Siddharth, Suresh, Upasna and Upasna, Sonia, Anjali, Kuriakos, Monali, Neha, Shivani, Shilpa, Sushmita, Upamita, Kiran, Sumtala, Shrishti, Vaidurja, Somi, Manvi, Rishita, I can't recognize my own handwriting at times, Prasenjit, John, Orko, Yogesh, and of course Sohan for his brilliant anchoring last night. Thank you. And with this, we come to the end of GRM 2024. We hope to see you soon again, and we hope to spread the word of our conference so that we can have an even bigger success next time. Thank you so much.
Please have high tea outside. This is just a